Collapse isn't the end, it's the raw materials for your next breakthrough. And in this video, I'm going to be going through how collapse has ultimately led to the compounding leverage that we've ultimately been able to build inside Killer Chaos OS. Like always, the main mission with these videos is to build our thinking OS, basically our internal operating system that governs how we're able to build backend systems, and also to call in visionaries, basically the people that are aligned with what it is that we're actively striving to solve for, which is killing chaos, and ultimately to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So when the floor drops, you ultimately have two choices. And this is one of the biggest lessons that I've learned within my life, which is ultimately you have either one or two choices, which is to freeze in the rubble, basically to give up and ultimately fold, or you could turn the rubble into raw material. And one of the most important things, throughout my entire journey, I've leaned more towards the second option, where I've been able to turn the rubble into raw material for my next breakthrough. And one of the most important things about this is that it's not always as, apparent when you do see it, that, hey, like this moment in your life that you're ultimately facing, you may feel a lot of pressure, and you may feel that, hey, this is, the breaking point or the collapsing point in order to, reach the next level. But then you ultimately realize that, hey, one of the biggest lessons that I've learned is ultimately learning that, that the biggest collapses often carry the most leverage. And what I mean by this is ultimately understanding that because when a system breaks, you're forced to see where it was fragile, and ultimately, say for example, you build an entire, lead intake form system, and ultimately when that system breaks, say you're not capturing enough leads, or you're ultimately capturing the wrong leads and specifying the wrong types and things to that nature, you ultimately understand that, hey, this system is ultimately collapsing, but ultimately this is also where we can also find leverage, because I think most times, you ultimately see this failure point as, one of the breaking points that, you cannot never recover from, but I see it more as where you can build more leverage into the future. And once you see this, you ultimately can rebuild twice as strong, because I think, this is what backend ops really is about. It's not about avoiding collapse, but it's about using collapse as a blueprint to build better and scale better into the future, which means that every failure teaches you where to reinforce, where to version, and also where to add redundancy. And I think, throughout my entire life, when I've been able to build the backend systems that we're actively building, one of the biggest, points or inflection points that I've had was ultimately when I, believed that we were facing, collapse. In the times where you believe that, hey, we are, we're building things and they're breaking, that's ultimately where you build the compounding leverage that ultimately allows you to build better into the future. Because I think you honestly learn a lot more, from your failures, a lot more than your successes. And I just ultimately want to make sure that, moving into the future, how can we possibly fail cheaply and also make sure that we're learning a lot more? Because, throughout my life, I've faced, so many times where I've, struggled a lot, just ultimately with the things I was actively doing in that present moment in time, which I may, speak about in a separate video. But ultimately, it was ultimately also translated into building, back-end systems, because ultimately you're able to understand that, hey, you're going to build things, they're always going to break as well, and you need to make sure that, hey, like when it does break, you have strategies in place to making sure that, hey, when you come back, you're actively learning. And I think one of the biggest, tools that you can actively have in your internal operating system, which I like to think of every single thing as a OS within itself, basically, what governs how you're able to think, make decisions, and also scale into the future. And through this, you ultimately are able to, find it within your own internal operating system to understand that, hey, if we're, facing collapse or points in times where we feel everything is breaking, we also need to make sure that we're understanding that there's a lot of leverage within that. And how do we find the leverage? That leverage is ultimately built through, reinforcement, where we basically say, hey, we failed in XYZ manner, and ultimately, since we failed in XYZ manner, that allows us to build better into the future. Say, for example, you writing a test and you ultimately fail. Ultimately, you're going to learn a lot more than you would if you just pass the test And I think this is true in many facets in life, when you ultimately expect your failures to be the point in time where you ultimately reinforce your learnings, and also reinforce where your version is, to ultimately understand that, hey, this is the level of knowledge that I need to get to, and also this is the level of knowledge that I have in this present moment in time, and how do I bridge that gap? What is the difference between then and now, and ultimately bridging that. And I think that's where ultimately understanding that collapse, you can build this compounding leverage through that, and also understanding that, hey, you need to understand where the failure points are. And I think also when you're building systems, you also need to stress test them. I think testing is one of the most important things, because it allows you to find out where the weaknesses are, because through those weaknesses you can ultimately build better into the future. And I want to make sure that in every facet of my life, that we're actively implementing our thinking OS, our internal operating system, that ultimately governs how we're able to make decisions, ultimately also to say how we're going to be scaling into the future, because this is going to play such a vital role in terms of ultimately building better into the future. Because if we're going to build new things and build cool things as at the same time into the future, we also need to make sure that we're having structure. And through that structure, I think we have to be super deep in the trenches, ultimately understanding that, hey, each and every single day we're going to face adversity, or we're going to face times where the system totally collapses. But ultimately, how can we actively build compounding leverage through that, by reinforcing our thinking, and also making sure that, hey, when we face adversity or things are breaking, we actively have these strategies. And also, like yesterday, like I spoke about in the video when I was mentioning one of my biggest failures, ultimately that ultimately reshaped my thinking in terms of how I'm able to build into the future. Because I think most leverage ultimately just comes from your biggest lessons or your biggest failures. And that so that also allows you to know that, hey, so next time you're not just surviving, but rather you're compounding. The people who thrive aren't the ones that never fall. They're the ones who learn how to turn collapse into strength. And I think one of the most important things that I've been able to learn throughout my entire life is that I don't care if I lose. Like, I could lose so many times and ultimately always show up. Because I think one of the biggest traits that you can ever form as a builder or an operator or an entrepreneur, or whichever those are, is ultimately being able to build anyway. Just being able to build through the storm, through the good, through the bad. I think that is one of the most important things. But tying that with purpose as well, because I think just understanding your why ultimately allows you to get through those bad times. You need to fall in love with the entire process. And now more than ever, I'm learning this so much, because you hear about it all the time, each and every single day, that, hey, you need to fall in love with the process, you need to understand how things are working, XYZ. But ultimately, you never truly understand it until you're faced with it. And I think a lot of people only realize this once they're actively facing it, in the sense that, hey, we're actively facing this present moment in time, where we need to realize that if we were too attached to the projects, or too attached to certain ways of thinking, that was not going to yield us our long-term results. We need to make sure that we're actively reminding ourselves in terms of the overarching goal that we're actively trying to hit on a day-to-day. Because I think now more than ever, for me at least personally, I've been able to super understand that, hey, this is the ultimate goal that we're actively chasing for each and every single day. And that purpose is ultimately the fuel that gets us through those bad times as well. And also, that purpose needs clarity as well. And I think when you're able to form that clarity, a clear mind, a sound mind, if you will, you're ultimately able to build better into the future. And you don't worry about so many things, because you're just ultimately just focused on how can we build the most amount of leverage that we possibly can, which is something that I've now started flipping a script to, which is ultimately understanding that I need to be able to create leverage in as much as I can do a lot of things on a day-to-day basis. I think creating that leverage, that ultimately compounds through time, which comes through collapsing. So basically the points in times where it forces me to put my ego aside and ultimately understand that, hey, like I'm wrong and I need to be okay with it, because ultimately being okay with being wrong is ultimately going to get me to the next level. And I think, so many times you may think that, hey, like you're always right, you know what you're doing, you always know the right answer. And the truth is, for me, like I never truly know, the right answer. I never truly know what it is that I'm doing. I just, build anyway. And I think that the mindset has ultimately allowed me to get through a lot of times. And ultimately, I know it's also going to, allow me to get through, even more times into the future, because I know that the scope and level of things that I'm facing today are ultimately going to be nowhere near to the scope and level of problems that I'm going to be facing into the future. Because I think when you set out this massive overarching goal to ultimately be able to redefine industries, inspire millions of people, it's ultimately going to come from points in times where you're ultimately facing collapse. And then the question then comes, how can you actively turn this collapse into compounding leverage that ultimately allows you to build better into the future? And I think through asking this question, it's going to bring a lot of, a new level of awareness that is ultimately going to allow me to ask, the deep questions of asking, hey, what about my own internal operating system is governing me in terms of understanding what I need to do in that present moment in time to find where the opportunities truly are as well, in order to build that compounding leverage through collapse as well. Because I think being able to ultimately understand where the system breaks and where your own internal operating system breaks, and then refining that on a day-to-day basis, I think would be super invaluable into the future. And then it just basically comes from understanding that, hey, if you look at the best operators in the world, they are ultimately able to turn this collapse or this point in failure in terms of their systems, or in terms of building whatever they're building into strength. And then it also makes me ask the question of, how can I actively just take some nuggets of inspiration from them and ultimately turn this into something that I can use on a day-to-day that is also aligned with me. Because I think with that, incorporating those specific nuggets and then fine-tuning it into my own self as well, I'm ultimately going to be able to form my own version of compounding leverage, or my own version of how I want to do things. And I think into the future it's going to play a super vital role, but through that also we need to make sure that we're also gaining that level of clarity. And it's not always going to be an easy task. It's not always going to be as straightforward as you input this and then you get this and you do all these things. I think it comes a lot from a lot of different factors, and that's where mental models comes in. Because ultimately, if we're able to think through solutions and create new features or new avenues for opportunities, we're ultimately going to be able to build this compounding leverage through collapse. And how do we actively do that? We ask the right questions and just ask questions anyways. And I want to reframe the narrative of also just asking the deep meaningful questions, because I think the quality of questions that we're going to be asking into the future and the way that we're thinking through solutions and problems is ultimately govern how we're going to be able to reach the next level. But it's going to be super hard. I mean, always up for a challenge. And I know that if it's worth it, it's never always going to be easy, but that's what makes it worth it. And I know that into the future we're going to have this massive level of impact. We're going to be redefining industries and we're going to be inspiring millions of people. But how do we actively do that on a day-to-day? We take these steps that we're actively taking, filming these videos, making sure that these are acting as our thinking OS, because into the future the payback is far greater than we could ever imagine. But it just takes action and just takes that consistent time of just doing boring things that ultimately gets us there. But I think focusing on just ultimately turning the rubble into raw material for the next level of your opportunities that you're able to create is the most that I've been able to drive for however long I've been able to, and also continue to drive, but at a new level into the future. So if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.